I worked all that day with the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave. The overtime shift had gone 3 hours long, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was out again. I'd been meaning to replace that bulb for 2 weeks. I kept forgetting. Small things like that had started slipping since the divorce: the bulb, the gutters, the loose hinge on the back door that made the whole frame shudder when the wind hit right. The house had needs and I had limits, and most nights those two things just stared at each other across a very tired room. My daughter was at her father's for the week. That was the other thing about that house. The silence had a different texture when she wasn't in it. Not peaceful, just hollow. Like the walls were aware of the absence and hadn't decided yet how to fill it. I made tea I didn't drink, scrolled through my phone without reading anything, and went to bed just before midnight. I woke up at 2:17. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone the moment my eyes opened. Not because an alarm went off, not because of a dream, but because something had already pulled me out of sleep before I even knew I was awake. That animal part of the brain that doesn't explain itself. It just sits up. The house was quiet. Too quiet in the way that makes you realize quiet isn't actually the absence of sound. It's just the sounds you've stopped noticing. The refrigerator hum, the boiler ticking, the way the bedroom window breathes slightly in its frame when the temperature drops. All of that was there, and underneath it something else. Dripping, slow, irregular, not the quick tap-tap-tap of a leaky faucet. This was longer between drops, patient, almost, like whatever was dripping wasn't in a hurry, like it had all night. I lay still for a full minute, telling myself it was the kitchen tap. I'd left it loose before. It made sense. There was always a reason. There is always a reason, that's what I told myself in the dark. The same way you tell a child there's nothing under the bed while refusing to let your own feet hang over the edge. I got up. The kitchen tap was off. Completely off. I stood there in the dark in my socks and turned it left and right just to be sure, and it was fine. Perfectly fine. The sound wasn't coming from there. I stood in the hallway and listened. It was coming from below me. Now here's the thing about that house: it was built in the late 70s, and the basement wasn't finished. It was the kind of basement that had a pull-chain light and bare concrete walls and a washer-dryer on one side and everything else in cardboard boxes that I kept meaning to sort through. My ex had used it as a workshop. There was still a pegboard down there with his tool outlines on it, those little painted silhouettes of hammers and wrenches like a crime scene for hardware. I hadn't gone down there in 4 months. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with my hand on the door, and I genuinely considered just going back to bed, telling myself it was a pipe. Old houses drip. Old pipes sweat and settle and do strange things in cold weather, and none of it means anything. But the dripping had a rhythm that was bothering me. Not a mechanical rhythm. Not the steady metronomic drip of a plumbing issue. It was irregular in a way that felt almost deliberate. 3 drops close together, then a long pause, then 1 drop, then 2, then nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then it would start again. I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Damp concrete and something else underneath it. Something warmer. I didn't identify it right away. I told myself it was mildew. I pulled the chain on the light. The far corner of the basement. The corner directly beneath my bedroom, beneath the spot where I'd been lying 20 minutes ago, had water pooled across the floor. Dark water, spreading slowly from a shape I couldn't quite make sense of at first. My brain kept trying to reorganize what I was seeing into something that made sense. The way you stare at a word too long and it stops looking like a word. There was a sleeping bag on the floor. Unrolled. Used. There was an indent in it. The shape of someone who had been lying there. Recently. The water was coming from a split section of pipe just above, dripping down onto a metal shelf that had been pushed against the wall, and from the shelf's edge it fell onto the concrete in that slow, uneven pattern. Next to the sleeping bag, a water bottle, a flashlight, a paper bag with food wrappers inside. Someone had been living in my basement. I don't remember going back up the stairs. I remember being in the kitchen with my back against the counter and my phone in my hand and my hands shaking so badly that I mistyped my passcode 3 times. I remember calling the police and being unable to properly describe what I'd found because my throat had sealed itself into something too small for words. They came. They searched the house, the whole house, every room, every closet, the backyard. the garage. Nobody was there. Whoever had been in that basement was gone. The back door, the one with the loose hinge, showed signs of being forced at some point. The frame around the latch was slightly splintered, though it was old enough damage that nobody could say when it had happened. The detective who walked me through it was calm in a professional way that I found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. He told me it wasn't uncommon. He said it like that, not uncommon, and I've never forgotten those two words because they imply a frequency that I was not prepared for. Opportunistic. Someone looking for shelter or looking for something else, who had found an unlocked basement window on the side of the house behind the overgrown hedges that I also kept meaning to trim. They couldn't tell me how long the sleeping bag had been there. Weeks, possibly. Maybe longer. I thought about all the nights I'd lain directly above that corner of the basement and heard nothing and felt safe. I thought about my daughter's bedroom, which is directly above the opposite corner. She'd been home for 2 full weekends in the past month. She'd had friends over. She'd played music too loud and I'd knocked on her door and told her to turn it down, and she'd rolled her eyes at me the way 15-year-olds do. And all of it, had been happening while someone was potentially in the floor beneath us. That's the part that didn't leave me. Not the fear of what could have happened. The fear of how completely unaware I had been. How much I had trusted the sounds of that house to tell me if something was wrong, and how thoroughly those sounds had told me nothing. I replaced the basement window lock that week. I replaced every lock. I got motion lights for the driveway and a ring camera for the front and back doors. I trimmed the hedges myself one Saturday afternoon, cutting them back so hard the yard looked almost bare. My neighbor came over to watch and asked if I was okay. I told her yes. I told her I just wanted to be able to see the house clearly. All of it. No corners, no overgrowth, no places that the light didn't reach. She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. I still wake up sometimes at 2 a.m. for no reason I can name. I still lie there and listen to the house and take inventory, the refrigerator, the boiler, the window in its frame. I still run through the list of ordinary sounds the way you check the locks before bed. But I added one more thing to the list. The basement. I listen for the basement now every single night. Not because I expect to hear something, because I need to confirm that I don't. There's a difference. I understand that difference in a way I didn't before, and I think about it more than I'd like. The bulb on the porch, I replaced that too. First thing. The winter break had felt like a good idea in September. By December, sitting alone in my childhood bedroom at 11 p.m. with a cold cup of ramen and a textbook I hadn't opened in 3 days. It felt like a punishment I designed for myself without fully thinking it through. My roommates had gone home to their families. My parents were in Florida for the month, their first real vacation in years, and they'd asked if I wanted to come. I'd said no. I had coursework. I had plans. I was 20 years old, and I needed to prove to myself that I could be alone in a house for a few weeks without it meaning anything. The house was old. Not charming old. Not the kind of old that gets called character. Just old in the way that rural houses get old when nobody's done much to them. The baseboards yellowed, the radiators loud, the walls thick in a way that makes you feel slightly underwater when you're inside them. I'd grown up in this house, and I knew every sound it made. That was the whole comfort of being there. I knew the language of it. I knew which stair creaked and where the kitchen pipes knocked when the heat came on, and how the back door dragged slightly against the frame in cold weather. I knew the house. That was the thing I kept telling myself. The first night was fine. The second night was fine. By the fourth night, I'd established a routine: work until 10, eat something bad for me, watch something on my laptop until I got tired, sleep. The silence outside was total. No traffic. No neighbors close enough to matter. Just the occasional wind off the fields that pressed against the windows and moved on. It was the fifth night when I heard it. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, in that shallow, half-conscious place where you're still aware of the room but your thoughts have started going strange and cinematic. And then something pulled me all the way back up. Breathing. Not my breathing. I checked that immediately, the way you do, held my own breath, went still, and listened. And it was still there. Slow, shallow, coming from the other side of the wall behind my head. My bed was pushed against the east wall of my bedroom. On the other side of that wall was nothing. Not another room, not a hallway. Just insulation and exterior siding and then outside. There was no reason for any sound to come through that wall. There was certainly no reason for that sound to come through that wall. I told myself it was the wind finding a gap somewhere. Old houses have gaps. Everyone knows that. Air moves through them in ways that defy logic. I'd heard strange things in this house my whole life, and every single one of them had turned out to be explainable. Every single one. That was the record. That was the data. I rolled over and faced the other direction and closed my eyes. It was still there. Not louder. Not closer. Just continuous. Patient. In and out, with the exact rhythm of a person lying very still and breathing very quietly. The kind of breathing someone does when they're trying not to be heard and haven't realized yet that they already are. I sat up. The room looked exactly like it always looked. Desk, dresser, closet door half open. The orange glow of the digital clock. Nothing wrong. Nothing out of place. And still, underneath the radiators ticking and the faint wind outside, that sound in out, slow and even and coming through the wall like it had every right to be there. I got up and put my hand flat against the wall. I don't know what I was expecting to feel. Vibration, maybe. Some physical confirmation that the sound was structural. Pipes, insulation settling, something. My hand was shaking slightly and I hated that. Hated being 20 years old and scared of a sound in a house I'd lived in my entire life. The wall was just cold. Still. Silent under my palm. But the sound continued, slightly to the left of where my hand was. I moved my hand, pressed it there. It stopped. I stood with my palm flat on the wall for a full 30 seconds. Not moving, barely breathing myself. Nothing. Just the house. Just the radiator. Just the wind. Then slowly it started again. Slightly to the right this time. Like whatever was making it had shifted. Adjusted. I stepped back from the wall. There are moments where fear stops being an emotion and becomes something more like information. Something your nervous system is transmitting because it has assessed the situation faster than your conscious mind can, and it needs you to move. This was one of those moments. My body had already made a decision. I was just catching up to it. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and the hoodie off the back of my desk chair, and I left the bedroom. Went downstairs without turning on any lights. Not because I was being strategic, but because I was operating on a frequency below rational decision-making. I went out the front door and sat in my car in the driveway with the doors locked and the engine running. I called my dad at midnight Florida time. He answered on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep, and I told him what I'd heard, and I listened to myself describe it, and I heard how it sounded. A 20-year-old boy, alone in a house, scared of breathing sounds, and I almost talked myself out of it mid-sentence. My dad didn't dismiss it. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Go to a motel. Tonight. I'll call someone to check the house tomorrow." He sent a neighbor, a retired guy 2 miles down the road who my parents had known for decades, to walk through the house the next morning. He went room to room, checked the attic, the basement, every closet. Nothing. No signs of entry. No signs of anything. He checked the exterior wall of my bedroom, the east wall. Found a section of the old insulation that had degraded and collapsed, creating an air pocket between the interior drywall and the exterior sheathing. With the wind coming from the east at the right angle and speed, it created a pressure differential through a small gap in the siding. A kind of sustained, rhythmic airflow. Breathing. The explanation was complete. It made physical sense. The neighbor explained it patiently while my dad related over the phone, and I sat in the motel parking lot and I nodded and said, "Yes. Okay, that makes sense, I understand." And I did understand. I understood it perfectly. I just kept thinking about the moment it stopped when I put my hand on the wall. And the moment it started again, slightly to the right. Wind doesn't adjust. Pressure differentials don't respond to the position of your hand on a surface. Air moving through a gap in insulation doesn't pause for 30 seconds and then resume from a different location as though it noticed where you were pressing and moved accordingly. I never told my dad that part. What was the point? He had an explanation. The neighbor had an explanation. The house had an explanation. I stayed in the motel for the rest of the week. Told my parents it was more comfortable, better Wi-Fi, easier to focus. They believed me because it was a believable lie and because parents often choose the version of a story that requires the least amount of fear on their part. I understand that now more than I did then. I went back exactly once, in the daylight, to get my things. I packed quickly. I didn't go into my bedroom beyond what was necessary. I didn't touch the east wall. I drove back to campus 4 days before classes started, and I sat in my empty dorm room, and I felt the specific relief of being inside walls that were thin, cheap, modern, paper-thin. Walls you could hear your neighbors through clearly, walls that hid nothing, walls that did not breathe. That was 2 years ago. I'm back at school now, and I don't think about it most days. But I have not gone home since. Not for spring break. Not for summer. Not for the holidays. My parents ask. I give them reasons, internships, plans, friends, the usual inventory of excuses that a college student can produce without much effort. The real reason is simpler. I know the neighbor's explanation is probably right. I know wind and pressure and degraded insulation are real things that produce real sounds, and that the human brain is a pattern recognition machine that will find intention in randomness every single time, especially at midnight, especially alone. I know all of that. I just don't want to lie in that bed again and put my hand on that wall and find out. The job listing had said compassionate, experienced, and comfortable with silence. I remember reading that last part and thinking it was an odd thing to put in a job listing. Comfortable with silence. Like whoever wrote it knew something about that house already, something they were choosing to phrase carefully. I'd been a caretaker for 11 years by then. I'd sat with people in their last months, their last weeks, their last days. I knew what silence meant in those contexts. I thought I understood every version of it. I took the job because the pay was good and because the agency described it as straightforward. An elderly woman, mid-80s, living in her own home with a dedicated room set up for full-time care. Mild dementia, limited mobility, no family nearby, a son on the West Coast who called on Sundays and sent money on time and had clearly made his peace with the distance between obligation and presence. My role was nights primarily, with a day caretaker who handed off at 7 each evening and picked back up at 8 each morning. The house was large for one person. Old money, you could tell, the kind of house that had been well built once and then maintained just enough to avoid embarrassment. High ceilings, original hardwood floors that announced every step. A kitchen that smelled permanently of something floral and slightly stale, like potpourri from a decade ago that had never been replaced, just tolerated. The woman, I'll call her my patient because that's what she was, had been mute for 6 years. Not selectively mute, not refusing to speak. The capacity had simply left her. The way certain things leave the elderly, not dramatically but quietly. Like a tide going out so gradually you don't notice until you look down and your feet are dry. She could follow simple instructions. She could track you with her eyes in a way that sometimes felt more alert than you expected and other times felt entirely absent. She ate when fed, slept on a schedule, and communicated in small gestures, a slight turn of the head, a hand movement, the quality of her gaze. She did not make sounds. That was established clearly in her intake file. Non verbal, no vocalizations. I settled into the routine within a week. Nights were quiet in the way institutional nights are quiet, the specific hush of a place organized around rest and medication schedules, where even your own footsteps start to feel like an intrusion. I did my checks every 2 hours. I kept the baby monitor on the kitchen counter so I could hear if she moved or became distressed. I read mostly. Sometimes I'd sit in the hallway outside her room for a while, just listening to the house settle. The first time I heard it, I thought I had imagined it. It was a Thursday just past 3 in the morning. I was in the kitchen, making tea, and the monitor was on the counter next to me, and out of it came, softly, almost below the threshold of hearing, a low, tuneless humming. I put down the kettle. It was coming from her room. Through the monitor, faint but unmistakable. A single wandering note, not a melody exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they're doing something else and they've forgotten they're making any noise at all. The sound of someone in their own private world. My first thought, genuinely, was that I'd mixed up the monitors. That somehow the signal was bleeding from a neighboring property. It happens with older monitor models. You pick up fragments of someone else's house, a television, a radio, a child being settled in another room. I checked the monitor. It was on the correct channel. I walked to her doorway and stood there in the dark. The humming was coming from her. She was lying on her back, eyes closed, hands folded on the blanket the way they always were, and she was humming. Low and wandering and completely unconscious. The way people hum in their sleep when some old comfort surfaces from somewhere deep and private. It lasted maybe 90 seconds. Then it stopped and the room went quiet and she didn't move again. I stood there for a long time. I didn't write it in the log that night. I don't know why. Some instinct told me to wait, to see if it happened again before I said anything. To make sure I hadn't simply been more tired than I realized. It happened again the following Tuesday. Same time, nearly to the minute. 3:10, 3:15. Through the monitor first, then confirmed in person. The same quality of sound, not distressed, not confused, just present. Like something that had no idea it was surprising anyone. I wrote it in the log that time. The day caretaker, a brisk and practical woman who had been with the patient for 3 years, read it the next morning and went very still in a way that told me something before she said anything. She told me it had happened before. Twice about 8 months ago before I'd started. She'd written it up and sent it to the agency and been told it was likely involuntary vocalization. Common in dementia patients, she was told, sometimes sounds emerge without conscious production, particularly during certain sleep states. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't communication. It wasn't a return of capacity. It was neurological noise. She said she believed that explanation when she'd been told it. I asked her if she still believed it. She picked up her bag and her keys and she said, "I believe what helps me do my job well." Then she left for the day and I was alone in the house. That afternoon, before my patient woke from her nap, I did something I'd been resisting for 2 weeks. I went to the bookshelf in the sitting room, the one with the framed photographs, and I looked at them properly for the first time. I'd noticed them before without examining them. Now I stood there and I looked. There were photographs spanning decades. The patient as a young woman, dark-haired and sharp-eyed. A husband who appeared in the middle years and then stopped appearing. And in many of the photographs, holidays, birthdays, ordinary afternoons in what looked like the same kitchen I made tea in every night. A young girl, dark-haired like her mother, bright-faced, present in photo after photo through what looked like childhood and early adolescence, and then, like the husband, simply gone. Not gone the way people go when they grow up and move away. Gone the way the photographs knew not to acknowledge directly. I found out later that evening. I looked up what I suspected and found a brief obituary, 17 years old, and a date that was decades ago now. The humming had been described in a memorial piece written by a family friend. Apparently it was something the girl did constantly, wandering through the house, tuneless and unconscious, driving her mother gently mad with it in the way that only beloved habits can. I sat with that for a long time. Here is what I know clinically. Dementia retrieves things. It reaches into the past and pulls forward fragments, words, behaviors, emotional memories, that the present can no longer access directly. A woman who has not spoken in 6 years might still carry, somewhere beneath the silence, the sounds that lived in her house for decades, the sounds that belonged to someone she loved. A neurologist would explain what I heard as retrieval, implicit memory, the brain doing what the brain does. I know that. I believe that. I am a practical person and I have been doing this work for a long time, and I do not frighten easily and I do not reach for explanations that require more mystery than the situation earns. But there is a moment I have not been able to fully set down, and I'll tell you what it is. 3 weeks after I found the photographs, I was doing my 2 a.m. check. I opened her door quietly, the way I always did, and I stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she was awake. Eyes open, looking at the ceiling, hands folded. Awake in that still, interior way she sometimes was in the night. Not distressed, not needing anything, just present in whatever the night meant to her. I stepped in to check her blanket and her eyes moved to me, and she hummed. Not asleep, not in some unconscious state. Eyes open, looking directly at me, and she hummed. That same low, wandering, tuneless note, for about 10 seconds. And then her eyes drifted back to the ceiling and the room went quiet and she didn't look at me again. I finished my check. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down and I put my hands flat on the table and I breathed. I have told myself the neurologist's version of this story many times since then, and it holds up. It is complete. It accounts for everything. What it doesn't account for, what I notice every time I tell myself the clinical explanation, is the specific quality of those 10 seconds. The eye contact, the timing, the way it felt less like a symptom presenting itself and more like someone showing me something they needed me to understand. I stayed in that job for 7 more months, until she passed quietly on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The day caretaker on shift, me already home and asleep. I went to the small service the son arranged. I stood at the back. I didn't speak to anyone. On the drive home, I turned the radio off and drove in silence, and somewhere on the highway I realized I was listening for something. Some faint, tuneless note at the edge of hearing, and I couldn't tell if I was hoping to hear it or hoping not to. I still haven't decided which would have been worse. The first drag happened at 11:47 p.m. I know because I was texting and my phone showed the time right when I stopped mid-sentence and went completely still. One of those freezes that happens before your brain has even finished processing what your ears just sent it. Pure animal response, body locking up while the thinking part scrambles to catch up. Came from directly above me. My bedroom was on the second floor, northeast corner of the house, and above it was the attic. Not a finished attic. Not the kind people convert into a bonus room or a home office. Just a raw attic with exposed joists and blown insulation and boxes of Christmas decorations and old sports equipment and the general accumulated weight of a family that had lived in one place for 20 years and never thrown anything away. My parents had been up there maybe twice in the last decade. There was no light up there except what came through the 2 small vents on either end. I had not been up there since I was 12. When my dad had sent me to find a specific box of tax records, and I'd spent 20 minutes crouched between joists in a flashlight beam feeling like the ceiling was breathing on me. I did not like the attic. And now something was in it. Not scurrying. Not the patchy, random movement of an animal that didn't know where it was going. This was a single, slow, deliberate drag. Something heavy moving maybe 4 feet across the floor directly above my bed, pausing, and then going silent. The pause was the worst part. Animals don't pause like that. They move continuously or they freeze completely. They don't move 4 feet and then stop in a way that feels considered. My parents weren't home. This is the part that every adult who reads this will immediately identify as the first mistake. Though I'd like to point out that being 16 doesn't actually prepare you for a protocol around attic sounds at midnight. My parents were at my aunt's place 40 minutes away, staying overnight because it had been a late dinner and my dad had been drinking. I was home because I had school the next morning, and because I was 16 and staying home alone felt like a right I had recently earned and was still proving to myself. My younger sister was at a sleepover. I was alone in the house and something was above me. I turned off my bedroom light. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct that said don't be visible before I even identified what I was afraid of. I sat on my bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and waited. For minutes of nothing. Long enough that I started assembling the rational explanation. Raccoon, maybe, or a squirrel that had found a gap in the roofline. Big enough to make a significant sound. Smart enough to pause when it heard something. It happened to houses. It happened all the time. My neighbor 2 streets over had a raccoon in his attic for a month before anyone dealt with it. These were real animals in the real world, and they made real sounds. I had almost fully constructed this explanation when it happened again. Same direction. Above my bed, moving from the east side toward the center of the room. Slow, heavy, deliberate 4 feet, maybe 5 this time. Then the pause. Then 1 more foot. Like whatever it was had stopped and then decided to go just a little further. Raccoons don't do that. I was on my feet before I made the decision to stand. Phone in hand, screen brightness all the way down, and I moved to my bedroom door and opened it as quietly as I have ever opened anything in my life. The hallway was dark. The house below me was exactly as I'd left it. Television off, kitchen light on the way it always was at night. The low hum of the refrigerator. Nothing wrong downstairs. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs. They were pull-down stairs, the folding kind, built into the hallway ceiling with a cord you yanked to bring them down. And I looked up at the hatch and I listened. Silence. The hatch was closed. The way it always was. The cord hanging straight and still. I stood there for a long time. My heart was doing something uncomfortable and I was breathing through my nose because for some reason breathing through my mouth felt too loud. Felt like it was giving something information about where I was and what I was doing. Then I called my dad. He answered after 3 rings, voice low and slightly blurred with sleep or wine or both. And I told him what I'd heard, and he went through the raccoon theory patiently, and I let him because what else was I going to say? He told me to check that the doors were locked, that the windows were locked, and to text him when I was back in my room. I checked the doors, checked the windows, everything locked, everything exactly as it should be. I went back upstairs. I was in the hallway, 5 feet from my bedroom door, when the drag happened for the 3rd time. Slower this time, much slower, like something moving with great care directly above the hallway where I was standing. I watched the ceiling as if I could see through it, as if watching would tell me anything. The sound moved from above my bedroom toward the center of the attic, directly overhead, and then it stopped. Right above me, directly above where I was standing in the hallway, the dragging stopped, and the silence that replaced it was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. The kind of silence that has a weight to it. The kind that means something is on the other side of it, very still, in the same way that you are very still. I did not text my dad. I did not wait. I went down the stairs, grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, and left the house. I sat in the car in the driveway for 2 seconds, just long enough to see that the attic vent on the east-facing side of the house, the one visible from the driveway, was dark. Then I drove to my dad's sister's house. I was there in 35 minutes. My dad met me at the door and looked at my face and didn't ask any questions, which is something I've never forgotten about him. He just stepped aside and let me in. The next morning he went back to the house with his brother-in-law, and they pulled down the attic stairs and went up there with flashlights. I waited in the kitchen. I heard them moving around up there for maybe 20 minutes. I heard them talking in the low, even voices men use when they're deciding how to describe something. They came down and my dad sat across from me at the kitchen table and he told me what they'd found. The Christmas boxes had been moved. Not knocked over, moved. Stacked differently than my mother remembered them, though she was quick to point out she hadn't been up there since last January and wasn't fully certain of the original arrangement. There was a section of insulation near the east vent that had been disturbed, flattened in roughly the shape of a person lying down, though my uncle said it could just as easily have been an animal that had been nesting there over time. The east vent they found was loose, had been loose for a while from the look of it. Wide enough, my uncle said, for a large animal. Or, he didn't say, but I watched him measure it with his hands and I watched him decide not to finish the sentence. They called a pest company. The pest company came and found no active animal presence. No droppings, no nesting material beyond the flattened insulation. They secured the vent and charged my parents $200 for the visit and said the disturbance was probably historical, something that had been there and moved on. That was the official version. I know my parents believed it or chose to believe it, which amounts to the same thing when you're a parent trying to decide how much fear to allocate to an event that is already over. Here's what I've never said out loud to anyone in my family. When I was standing in that hallway directly below the attic, in the moment when the dragging stopped right above me, in that specific silence, I heard something else. Faint, brief, easy to dismiss. A shift in weight. Not a drag, not a movement. Just the subtle, unmistakable creak of a joist adjusting under a load. The sound a floor makes when someone on it stops moving but doesn't stop standing. I know the difference between a floor settling and a floor being stood on. I grew up in that house. I knew every sound it made. My bedroom floor made that exact creak when I stepped out of bed in the morning, on the left side, near the window. I knew what it meant. Something in that attic had stopped dragging, and then it had stood still, and the floor had told me exactly what standing still felt like from underneath. I've told this story a few times over the years, always with the raccoon theory as the ending because it's the one people accept. Ties things up. It makes the story a story instead of something else. But I was 16 and I grew up in that house and I knew what I heard. And whatever was above me that night, moving slowly, pausing deliberately, stopping directly overhead in the dark. I have never once, in the 8 years since, convinced myself it had 4 legs. The house had been too quiet for 8 months. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Not the kind you earn after a long day. The kind that greets you at the door and means something good is waiting inside. This was the other quiet. The kind that accumulates in rooms when the person who gave them sound is no longer there to fill them. The kind that sits in a chair, that occupies the side of the bed, that follows you from room to room like something that forgot it was supposed to leave when she did. Margaret had been gone since March. 41 years we had spent in that house, and now it was November, and I was still learning how to move through rooms that remembered her better than they remembered me. The children had offered, all three of them, in their various ways. The eldest wanted me to sell and move closer to her. The middle one thought I should travel, fill the calendar, keep moving. The youngest, the most honest of the three, said he just didn't want me to be alone in that house, and I respected him most for saying the plain thing. I told them all the same thing I meant completely. I was not ready to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. 41 years of a life doesn't pack into boxes without taking something essential with it, and I wasn't willing to find out what that something was. So I stayed. I learned the house again as a solitary thing. Learned which silences were tolerable and which ones weren't. Learned that early morning was hardest and that late evening, paradoxically, was easier. Something about the darkness made the absence less visible. I cooked simple things I didn't particularly want to eat. I watched programs she would have hated and felt guilty for enjoying them. I slept on my side of the bed and did not cross the invisible line to hers and told myself this was a reasonable thing to do. Her sister called every Sunday. My children rotated weekend visits through some coordinated schedule they thought I hadn't noticed. The doctor told me grief had no timetable and meant it kindly, and I appreciated it the way you appreciate correct information that helps you not at all. This was my life. I was managing it. The knocking started on a Wednesday night in late November. I was already in bed, not sleeping, doing the thing I'd developed since March of simply lying in the dark and waiting for the night to finish. The room was cold. I'd stopped bothering with the heating upstairs the way I used to, another small accommodation to living alone in a house sized for two. And through the wall, from the other side of the headboard, came 3 knocks. Not loud, not alarmed. 3 knocks in a very specific pattern, 2 quick, 1 slow. Pause. Then 1 more, soft, like a question. I sat up. My heart was doing something I hadn't expected. Not pounding with fear, something more complicated than that. Something that recognized the pattern before my mind had fully caught up to what recognition meant. 2 quick, 1 slow, 1 soft. That was our knock. This requires explanation, because I'm aware of how it sounds without it. 41 years ago, very early in our marriage, we developed a private language of knocks. It had started as a joke. She had a habit of disappearing into the bathroom to read when she wanted solitude, and I had a habit of interrupting her. And she had told me one evening that she needed a knock that meant I need 5 more minutes versus a knock that meant something is actually wrong. So we invented one. 2 quick, 1 slow, 1 soft meant I'm here, I'm fine, not yet. 1 long knock meant come in. 3 rapid knocks meant emergency. We used it for years. On hotel room doors during travel. On the bathroom door. On her studio door when she was painting and didn't want to be disturbed. On my office door when she had something to tell me but wasn't sure of her welcome. It became the private shorthand of a marriage. One of those small languages that 2 people build together over decades without noticing until suddenly they're the only 2 speakers left. And now it was coming through the bedroom wall at 11:30 on a Wednesday in November, 8 months after she died. I sat in bed and I did not move for a very long time. The rational mind is a persistent thing. It doesn't go quiet easily, even when every instinct you have is pulling in a different direction. I sat there and I made myself think through explanations with the same methodical patience I'd applied to 40 years of engineering work. Pipes in the wall, the heating system contracting in the cold. The house settling the way old houses settle, wood and plaster adjusting to temperature changes in patterns that can sound remarkably structured. A branch against the exterior siding, though there was no wind and no branch close enough. I went through every explanation. I held each one up and examined it. And then, because I am the kind of man who has always believed that the only way to know something is to look directly at it, I put my hand flat on the wall behind the headboard. Cold plaster. Solid. The old house breathing the way it always breathed. I said, out loud into the dark room, and I want you to understand that I am a 73-year-old man who has never spoken to empty rooms, who does not believe in the thing this action implied, who built a career on measurable and demonstrable reality. I said, Maggie. Silence. Then, two quick, one slow, one soft. I have thought about that moment every day since. I have sat with it from every angle I can find. I have tested it against every rational framework I have, and I have not been able to fully break it, which is the most unsettling thing about it. Not the knock itself, but the fact that my own mind, which I have trusted completely for 7 decades, cannot cleanly resolve it. What I know, old houses make sounds. Temperature and wood and plaster produce patterns that can be mistaken for intentionality. The grieving brain is in a heightened state of pattern recognition. It is looking for the lost person in everything, in birdsong, in the shape of strangers from behind, in the way light falls on a particular object at a particular time of day. This is documented. This is human. There was nothing supernatural in that room. What I cannot fully explain away. The specificity. Not just a knock pattern, but that knock pattern. The one that had existed between exactly 2 people in the world, used privately for 4 decades, known to no one else who was living. Not a simple rhythm that chance could produce, a 4-beat sequence with specific timing, specific weight on specific beats, that I had heard 1,000 times in 1,000 ordinary moments and would have recognized at any volume, in any context, in any state of mind. It happened twice more over the following weeks. Once on a Friday night when I had been looking at photographs, her photographs, the ones from before I knew her, the ones she kept in a hatbox on the top shelf of the closet that I had never opened until she was gone. Once on a morning in December when I was standing in the kitchen making tea and it came from the kitchen wall, faint and certain. I told her sister on the Sunday call. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "That sounds like something she would do," and we were both silent for a while after that, the 2 of us sitting with it on either end of a phone line, not needing to resolve it. I told my youngest son at Christmas. He sat with it more carefully than I expected. He's an engineer too, he has my habits of mind, and he went through the same explanations I had gone through and arrived at the same place. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking, which is sometimes the most honest thing 2 people can do with something that doesn't have a clean answer. The knocking hasn't come back since December. For months now of the ordinary silence, the house doing only what houses do, nothing that requires explanation. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I still haven't crossed the invisible line. But I leave the lamp on her nightstand on now. Low setting, the one she used when she was reading and I'd already gone to sleep. She always said it didn't bother me because I could sleep through anything, and she was right, I always could. I just wanted it on. Not because I believe something is there in any literal sense. Not because a grieving old man with a physics degree has suddenly decided the rules of the world are different from what he spent his life learning they were. Just because 41 years of a habit is a long time. And because 2 quick, 1 slow, 1 soft meant I'm here, I'm fine, not yet. And because whatever that sound was, pipes, plaster, the old house talking to itself in the cold. When I heard it, for the first time since March, the quiet had a different quality. Not empty, just waiting. I find that I can live with waiting considerably better than I could live with the other thing. So the lamp stays on, and some nights, before I close my eyes, I knock back. The drive home from a 12-hour shift does something specific to your brain. Not tired exactly, past tired. There's a state on the other side of exhaustion that feels almost chemical, where everything has a slight unreality to it, where the streetlights seem too bright and your own hands on the steering will look slightly unfamiliar. I'd been a nurse for 6 years by then, and I knew that state well. I'd learned to function inside it. You develop a kind of autopilot. The body keeps doing the necessary things while the mind floats somewhere slightly above the situation, observing without fully participating. It was 4:17 in the morning when I pulled into my parking spot. The building was a 6-story walk-up in a neighborhood that had been almost nice for as long as I'd lived there, close enough to the hospital that the commute was manageable, far enough from anything interesting that the rent stayed reasonable. I'd been in the apartment for 3 years. 3rd floor, end unit, 1 bedroom. I knew it the way you know a place you've spent 1,000 ordinary nights in, completely without thinking, the way you know your own name. I took the stairs because the elevator in that building moved at a speed that suggested it was making a philosophical point about patience, and at 4 in the morning I didn't have the reserves for philosophy. 3rd floor, end of the hallway. I unlocked the door and went in. The apartment was dark the way I'd left it. Blackout curtains in the bedroom, The small light above the stove on a timer the way it always was. The particular quality of air that belongs to a space that has been closed up all day. Familiar. Completely familiar. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked off my shoes, and went to the kitchen on pure muscle memory. This is the part one need you to understand about that specific kind of tired. The post 12-hour shift, 4 in the morning, I haven't eaten since 7 p.m. tired. Your sequence of actions becomes almost ceremonial. Fixed. The same order every time, like a ritual that your body performs while your mind gets a few minutes off. Keys on the hook. Bag by the door. Shoes off. Kitchen. Fridge. I opened the refrigerator. I stood there in the refrigerator light looking at its contents. Leftover rice, half a lemon, something in a container I didn't remember making, and I reached for the water filter pitcher on the second shelf. And behind me, across the apartment, the bathroom cabinet closed. Not loudly, not a slam, just the soft, definitive click of a cabinet door that has been eased shut by someone who knows how to close things quietly. I stood with my hand on the pitcher and I did not move. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the microwave said 4:19. The apartment was silent in every direction except for the sound of my own blood, which I was suddenly intensely aware of, moving through my ears at a volume that felt inappropriate for the situation. I had not opened the bathroom cabinet. I had come in the front door, crossed the apartment in the dark, and gone directly to the kitchen. The bathroom was on the opposite side of the apartment from the kitchen, separated by the living room and a short hallway. I had not gone near it. The bathroom cabinet in my apartment had a specific behavior. It didn't stay closed on its own unless you pushed it to the point where the magnetic latch caught. If you just swung it to, it would drift back open slowly. I knew this. I had been meaning to fix it for 8 months. Every morning I'd push it properly shut, and by evening it would be open again. And I'd become so accustomed to this that I'd stopped registering it as something that required attention. A cabinet that doesn't stay closed on its own does not close itself. I stood at the open refrigerator for what felt like a very long time but was probably 15 seconds. My mind was doing the thing exhausted minds do under sudden stress. Cycling rapidly between explanations, reaching for anything that resolved the situation cleanly. I went through them fast. I had not opened it. The building could produce sounds that mimicked cabinet clicks, pipes, the elevator shaft, sound traveling through walls from neighboring units. My neighbor directly across the hall had the same layout. Could it be? No. I knew the acoustics of that apartment. I had lived there for 3 years. Sound from the hallway came through differently. What I'd heard had come from inside. I was still holding the refrigerator door open. I let it close. The kitchen went dark and I stood in the dark, and I did not reach for the light switch because something in me, the same something that had kept me functional through 6 years of night shifts, the same instinct that had made me good at reading situations quickly in a hospital context, that something was telling me very clearly and without drama that I did not want to announce myself. I thought about my phone. It was in my bag by the front door, 20 feet away, through the living room. I thought about the front door itself, directly behind my bag, 30 feet maybe, across open floor, no cover. I thought about the kitchen, the drawer to my left, which had a layout I knew by heart, which contained, second from the front on the right side, a long pair of kitchen scissors I used for everything because I own no proper knives worth mentioning. I opened the drawer. By feel, in complete darkness, I found the scissors in 4 seconds. I held them in my right hand and my phone was my only other thought. I needed my phone, I needed to be at the front door, these were the same direction and I needed to move toward them now, quietly, before whatever was in my bathroom decided to move first. I crossed the living room in the dark in my socked feet on a floor I knew well enough not to make a sound on. Past the couch on the left. Past the coffee table on the right. I knew where the one floorboard that creaked was, 3 feet from the hallway entrance, slightly left of center, and I stepped around it without thinking, the way you step around something you've navigated 1,000 times. I reached my bag. I reached the front door. I got my phone out of the front pocket without taking my eyes off the hallway that led to the bathroom. The hallway was dark. The bathroom door was slightly open, the way I always left it, cracked about 4 inches to let the air circulate. I could not see anything beyond it. I unlocked my phone and called 911, and I opened my front door while I was still dialing, and I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door mostly shut behind me, and I stood there with my back against the wall next to my own front door, and I talked to the dispatcher in a voice so quiet she asked me twice to speak up. They came in 11 minutes. 2 officers. They went through my apartment while I stood in the building hallway, and I listened to them move through each room, and I tracked the sounds. Living room, bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, and then a pause. One of them came to the front door and told me to stay where I was. They found him in the bathroom, behind the shower curtain. A man I had never seen before in my life. Late 30s, no shoes, a jacket that was too light for November. He had come in through the window in the bathroom, the one I'd left cracked because the bathroom fan had stopped working 2 months ago and the moisture would build up otherwise. 3rd floor, but there was a utility structure on the exterior of the building that someone who knew what they were doing, or was desperate enough not to care about what they were doing, could use to reach it. He had a bag with him. He had been in my apartment for, the officers estimated, based on what they found, at least 2 hours before I came home. 2 hours. I had been on shift. The apartment had been dark. He had been inside for 2 hours in the dark, in my space, among my things, and then I had come home and turned on the refrigerator light and stood there looking at leftover rice while he stood in my bathroom 15 feet away deciding what to do next. The cabinet. He had been in the cabinet when he heard me come in. He had been looking for something, prescription medication. The officer said that was usually what it was in situations like this. And he had heard my key in the lock, and he had closed the cabinet and gotten behind the shower curtain, and he had waited. He had closed the cabinet, and he had not pushed it all the way to the magnetic latch. That's the part. Out of everything, the 2 hours, the shower curtain, the utility structure on the side of the building, all of it, that's the part that stays with me most. Because he was careful. He was practiced at being quiet and careful, and he almost made it. He almost made that cabinet click, and I almost didn't hear it. I was at 4:19 in the morning tired, post-shift tired, floating above myself tired. The refrigerator door was open, and I was looking at leftover rice, and my brain was mostly offline. But something heard it. Something that 6 years of night shifts had built in me. Some layer of attention that doesn't fully clock out even when everything else does. Something heard a cabinet close in a room I hadn't gone near, and it knew. I fixed the window latch the next day. I fixed the bathroom cabinet latch the same day, while I was at it. I don't leave windows cracked anymore. Any window, any floor. And I've thought many times about how that night could have gone if I'd been 10% more tired. If the shift had run longer. If I'd taken the elevator and given myself 4 more minutes to sink deeper into the autopilot. If the refrigerator had been on the other side of the kitchen, and I'd been facing the wrong direction when that cabinet closed. I think about those versions of that night more than I think about what actually happened. That's the thing about the close ones. The actual event is survivable. It's all the almost versions that follow you home. We bought the house because of the neighborhood. That's what we told ourselves and each other and anyone who asked, and it was true as far as it went. Good schools, quiet street, the kind of block where people still wave from driveways and remember your name after one introduction. We were 32 and 31, and we had a 4-month-old who had no opinion about real estate yet, but whose entire future, we had decided, depended on us making the right decision about it immediately. The house was new construction. That was the other thing. Everything clean, everything sealed, everything smelling of fresh paint and factory carpet, and the particular optimism of a building that hadn't had time to develop problems yet. We moved in on a Saturday in September. By November, we had a routine. My wife handled the early morning shift with the baby. She was still on leave, and she'd always been the morning person between us. I took the late nights. That was the arrangement. I'd come to bed around 11. She'd get up around 2 when the baby needed feeding, and I'd take over around 4 if it was a difficult night and let her sleep through to 7. The monitor lived on the kitchen counter during the day and on my wife's nightstand at night. Standard audio monitor, we'd gone back and forth on the video version. But the apartment we'd moved from had felt watched enough by its own security system, and neither of us had wanted to add more screens to the bedroom. Audio was fine. Audio was enough. You could hear everything you needed to hear. That was what we thought. The first time I heard it, I was in the kitchen at 11:30 on a Tuesday, the last part of my evening wind down, making the tea I drank every night before bed. The monitor was on the counter. My wife had left it there after the 9 o'clock feeding and hadn't moved it upstairs yet. The baby was asleep. I could hear the clean, steady rhythm of infant breathing, that slightly effortful sound that new babies make, the sound that I had spent 3 months learning to read like a language. Underneath it, barely, the way a second instrument sits under the main melody. Something else. I put down the kettle. It was low, textured. Not the static the monitor sometimes produced when the signal wasn't clean. This had a different quality, a varying quality, the way sound changes when it's shaped by a mouth and not produced by interference. I stood over the monitor and I listened, and my brain did the thing brains do with ambiguous information. It tried to pattern match, tried to find the familiar thing hiding inside the unfamiliar. Found it faster than I wanted it to. It sounded like whispering. Not words I could make out. Not any sequence I could isolate into meaning. Just the texture and rhythm of whispering, the soft fricative quality of it, the way it rose and fell in the cadence of language without quite crossing into anything decipherable. Present for maybe 20 seconds. Then it softened further and dissolved into the static, and the baby's breathing was all that was left. I stood over the monitor for another minute, completely still. Then I went upstairs and checked the nursery. The baby was asleep in the crib on her back, arms loose the way they go when sleep is deep and real. The room was exactly as we'd left it. Nightlight on, white noise machine running in the corner, the mobile above the crib still and silent. Window locked. Door to the closet fully open the way I always left it, because a half-open closet door had bothered me since childhood, and I saw no reason to tolerate it as an adult. Nothing wrong. Nothing out of place. I stood there for a while watching her breathe, and then I went to bed. I didn't tell my wife. This requires a specific kind of explanation that I think other new parents will understand without much elaboration. When you have an infant, your relationship with fear changes. Fear becomes so abundant and so constant and so frequently revealed to be irrational. Every strange sound, every unusual sleep position, every cough, every degree of fever, that you develop a filtering system. You learn to hold certain fears privately until they repeat, until they establish themselves as real rather than as the product of sleep deprivation and hypervigilance. You don't report every shadow. You wait for the second occurrence. The second occurrence was Thursday. Same time, nearly. I was in the kitchen and the monitor was on the counter, and I was doing nothing in particular. Standing at the sink, looking at the window above it, thinking about a work problem I'd been carrying around all week. The baby's breathing steady and even. And then, underneath it, the whispering began again. This time I was more prepared and more analytical about it. I picked up the monitor and held it closer, and I listened with the specific attention of someone who has decided to stop being afraid and start gathering information. I listened for the duration, 40 seconds this time, maybe 45, and I tried to identify what I was actually hearing rather than what my first instinct had labeled it. The rhythm was wrong for speech. That was the first thing. Real speech, even whispered speech, has specific prosodic patterns, stress and pause and emphasis that reflect the structure of language, the grammar of it. What I was hearing had rhythm, but the wrong kind of rhythm. More regular than speech. More metronomic. Not language. Pattern. The second thing I noticed was the relationship to the static. Whatever it wasn't sitting under the static, it was in the static. Woven into it at a frequency that the monitor speaker was rendering as something close to a human vocal quality without actually being one. On Friday morning, I looked up our specific monitor model and the frequency it operated on, and I spent about 40 minutes going down a research path that people who live in dense residential areas apparently know well, and I did not. Baby monitors pick up signals from other baby monitors. This is a documented, common, entirely mundane phenomenon. Two monitors on the same frequency in sufficient proximity to each other will bleed through, producing the audio from one household on the speaker in another. We were in a new development. The houses were close. The walls were new and thin in ways that the listing had not emphasized. It was entirely plausible, statistically likely even, that one of our neighbors had an infant and a monitor and the same frequency setting. I told my wife over dinner. I framed it factually, which was how she preferred things, and she listened and nodded and said, "So we're hearing someone else's baby." I said probably yes, or the audio near someone else's baby. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Is there a baby?" I said I wasn't sure. The signal had always come with background room sound, the the ambient noise of a space being occupied. It was plausible. She said, "You should change the frequency." I said I would. I did that same evening. Switched the monitor to the secondary channel as the manual described and confirmed the connection and put it back on the nightstand. Clean signal. Just the baby. No interference. That should have been the end of it. And in practical terms, it was, I never heard the sound on the new frequency. The problem was resolved in exactly the way a technical problem gets resolved. Except that I kept thinking about something I hadn't told my wife. In those 45 seconds on Thursday, when I was holding the monitor and listening analytically and telling myself it was interference, in the last few seconds before the signal dissolved, the pattern had shifted. The regular rhythm I'd identified had broken briefly into something less regular. Something that the part of my brain I was trying to keep offline kept insisting had the specific structure of 2 syllables. A name, maybe, or something that rhymed with one. I know what I've just described sounds like a man who was sleep-deprived and primed for pattern recognition and living in the heightened emotional state that a new infant produces in a parent who loves them and is frightened for them constantly. I know it sounds like someone finding language in noise the way people find faces in wood grain and animals in clouds. I know this because I am that person and I know my own vulnerabilities. But I also know what I heard in those last 2 seconds, and I know that the syllables I heard were not the nonsense syllables of audio interference on a shared radio frequency. They were the 2 syllables of my daughter's name. A name we had finalized 4 days before she was born. A name that was not on any public document yet. A name that, at that point, had been spoken by no more than a dozen people in the world. I changed the frequency and I never heard it again, and my daughter is 2 years old now and completely fine, and everything about this has a rational explanation that I can construct fully and present coherently, and that accounts for all available evidence. I just don't say her name out loud in the house at night anymore. I don't know exactly when I started doing this. It became a habit so quietly that I didn't notice it until my wife pointed it out one evening, gently, with the careful tone she uses when she's decided to address something she's been watching for a while. She asked me why I'd stopped. I told her it was nothing. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She looked at me for a moment in the way that 11 years together produces in a person. The look that means I know you better than that answer. And then she let it go, the way she sometimes does when she's decided that the truth will keep and this isn't the right moment for it. The monitor sits on her nightstand. Clean signal. New frequency. Our daughter's breathing fills the speaker all night, steady and real, and completely unambiguous. I still check it sometimes. In the kitchen, late, when the house is quiet and I'm the last one awake. I pick it up and I hold it and I listen to the clean sound of her breathing, and underneath that, just the static, just the white noise of a working electronic device. Nothing else, nothing shaped like a voice or a pattern or a name. Nothing. I put it down and I go to bed. But I leave the kitchen light on now. Every night, without exception, I leave the kitchen light on. And I have never once been able to explain to my wife or to myself exactly why. The job had seemed perfect in the listing. Private estate, countryside location, 3 weeks of house sitting while the owners traveled through Europe. A small weekly payment that was frankly generous for what amounted to living alone in a large house and watering plants twice a week. I was 26 and between things, between jobs, between apartments, between the version of myself I'd been and whatever came next. The timing felt less like coincidence and more like the universe making a practical suggestion. I said yes without visiting first. This was the mistake I'd replay later from every angle, the decision I'd turn over and examine the way you examine something after it's broken, looking for where the fault line was, whether it had always been there. You don't agree to live somewhere for 3 weeks without walking through it first. You don't accept keys from a man you met once through a house-sitting agency and drive 3 hours into countryside you don't know and arrive after dark and let a heavy door close behind you without knowing what you've closed yourself into. You don't. And yet, the estate was large in the way that old countryside properties are large. Not aggressively, not showily, but with the quiet confidence of something that has occupied significant space for a very long time and sees no reason to apologize for it. Main house, 2 floors, 7 rooms that I counted on the walkthrough. I gave myself that first night with every light on. A utility wing attached at the back. Grounds I couldn't fully see in the dark, but that the agency description had called extensive, which in property language means you won't find the edges without committing to it. The owners had left a folder on the kitchen counter. Wi-Fi password, emergency contacts, instructions for the boiler, a hand-drawn map of the fuse box. At the bottom of the last page, a single line that I read twice and then set down without fully processing. The house makes sounds at night, all old houses do. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Written by someone who no longer lived there and was currently in Portugal. The first night I slept badly and attributed it entirely to the strangeness of a new space. The second night I slept better. By the fourth night I had developed the shape of a routine, work on my laptop in the kitchen during the day where the light was best, cook something simple in the evening, read in the sitting room until 10 or 11, sleep. The silence outside was the deepest I had ever experienced. No traffic. No neighbors. Just the countryside doing what countryside does at night, which is nothing comprehensively in every direction. It was on the sixth night that I heard the note. I was in the sitting room, book open, not reading, doing the thing where your eyes move across lines without transmitting any information, your mind somewhere else entirely. The house was settled into its nighttime state, the boiler quiet, the old beams doing their occasional tick and shift. And into that settled silence came a sound so faint and so unlikely that my first response was to assume I'd imagined it. A single piano note. Low register. Not a chord, not a sequence, just one note, struck cleanly and allowed to decay. The kind of note a pianist plays to test an instrument's tuning before they begin. Present for perhaps 3 seconds and then gone, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the silence before it. Charged, somehow. Like the air after lightning. I sat completely still. The sitting room had no piano. I had walked through every room in this house with every light on, and I knew its contents with reasonable confidence. There was no piano in the sitting room, no piano in the dining room, no piano anywhere on the ground floor that I had seen. I had not been upstairs beyond the bedroom I was using. I told myself what anyone would tell themselves. Sound travels strangely in old buildings. The note had come from somewhere else, from outside possibly, from a neighboring property carried on the night air through a gap in the old window frames. There were explanations. The folder had said so explicitly. Old houses make sounds at night. I went to bed. 3 nights passed without it. Long enough that I'd filed it under unexplained but resolved and moved it to the back of the mental shelf. I cooked and worked and read and walked the grounds in the daylight and found their edges eventually. A stone wall at the far end of a field, a small outbuilding I hadn't known was there, a garden that had been left to go slightly wild in a way that felt intentional rather than neglected. The estate was beautiful in daylight, melancholy in the particular way of old places that have held a great deal of life and now hold considerably less, but beautiful. I started to understand why someone would own it, started to understand the attachment. On the 9th night it came back. Same note, same register, same clean, unhurried decay. I was in bed this time, almost asleep, and it arrived so softly that it threaded directly into the half-conscious space between waking and sleep, and for a moment I absorbed it without alarm, just a sound, just a note, just the house. Then I was fully awake. This time I counted the silence after it. 61 seconds. I counted deliberately, 1 number per second, watching the ceiling. Then it came again. The same note, the same duration, the same decay into silence. 63 seconds. Then again. I lay in the dark and I counted intervals, and the note returned 7 times over the next 8 minutes. Each time the same pitch, the same clean single strike, the intervals varying by only a few seconds in either direction. Patient. Methodical. Like something being tested or demonstrated or maintained. There is a specific kind of fear that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with adrenaline and a racing heart and the full biological alarm system engaged. It seeps in. It comes through the small spaces in your rationality, the gaps between the explanations you've assembled, and it settles there quietly and just waits. That was what I felt lying in that bed, listening to that single note repeat itself in the dark of a house I didn't know. Not panic. Something slower and more thorough. I got up on the 10th repetition, stood in my bedroom doorway and listened to the house. The note was coming from above me, from the 2nd floor, from the section of the house I'd been using as a corridor to my bedroom and nothing else, the rooms I'd glanced into on arrival and not revisited. One of those rooms was directly overhead. I went upstairs. The hallway was dark and long, and the doors off it were all closed the way I'd found them on arrival. For doors. I stood at the bottom of the hallway and listened, and the note came again, and it was the third door, left side, no question about the direction. I put my hand on the door handle. Here is where I want to be precise about what I was thinking, because I've told this story a few times and people always assume I was terrified, and that's not quite accurate. I was frightened, yes, but I was also, and this is the part that's harder to explain, compelled. The note had a quality that wasn't threatening exactly. It wasn't aggressive or urgent. It was almost the opposite, patient, like something that had been making the same sound for a very long time and had developed no particular investment in whether anyone heard it. That quality was somehow worse than aggression would have been. I opened the door. The room was empty of furniture except for a sheet-covered shape against the far wall, and the moonlight coming through the uncurtained window was enough to see it clearly for what it was: a piano. Upright, old, the sheet gray with dust. Against the wall in an empty room with a closed door. The room was cold, significantly colder than the hallway. I stood in the doorway and looked at it, and the house was completely silent. No note, nothing. Just the sheeted piano and the moonlight and the cold and me standing at the threshold of a room I hadn't opened until now. I did not go in. I pulled the door closed and went back to my bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at my phone and I thought about calling the agency, about calling the owners, about the practical reality of telling someone at 11:40 at night that I was frightened of a piece of furniture in a covered room. I did not call anyone. I left the next morning. Packed in 20 minutes, left the key on the kitchen counter next to the folder, sent the agency an email from the car that cited a family situation, which was not true but was the kind of explanation that doesn't invite questions. I have thought many times about what was making that sound. Old pianos in cold rooms produce sounds as the wood and strings contract and expand with temperature. This is documented and real and entirely explainable. The specific quality of a single low note, repeated at intervals, is within the range of what an aging instrument in an unheated space can produce without human involvement. I know this. I've looked it up more than once with the specific intention of finishing the story cleanly. What I can't finish cleanly is the interval. Temperature-related sounds in old instruments are irregular. They follow the randomness of material physics, the unpredictability of wood grain and metal fatigue. They don't produce the same note at 60-second intervals with the consistency of something keeping time. Something keeping time does that. I've never gone back. I've never contacted the owners, never looked up the estate's history, never tried to find out what that room was used for or how long that piano had been in it, or whether the people who left me that folder in the kitchen had heard what I heard and decided that nothing to worry about was close enough to the truth to write down. Some questions have answers that don't make the question better. I decided a long time ago that this was one of them. The note still comes back to me sometimes, usually in the specific silence just before sleep, in that threshold place where the mind loosens and things you've stored carefully in the daytime find their way back out. One note, low register, 3 seconds, decay. And then silence. And then I wait the way I waited in that bed, counting the seconds until the next one. It never comes, of course. It's just a memory. Just a sound in a house I left 8 years ago and have never returned to and never will. But I count anyway. Every time. I count anyway. That was the last one. And if that final note is still echoing in your head right now, good. That means it worked. These 8 stories are why this channel exists. Not to entertain you with fiction, but to remind you that the most unsettling thing in the world is a sound you can't explain in a place you thought was safe. If these stories got under your skin, you already know where you belong. Subscribe to Black Fears, hit the bell, and stay close, because the next one is already waiting in the dark.